Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really sinking our teeth into something truly legendary, the dramatic final test of the Shaolin warrior monk. And specifically, that really intense tale of branding the dragon and tiger onto their forearms. We've got a fascinating stack of source material here, including excerpts from Shaolin Forearm branding, myth and history, which lets us take a, detailed, in-depth look at the line between legend and, well, reality.
That's exactly right. Our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack these powerful narratives, examine the claims and the counterclaims you find within the sources themselves, and see if these, frankly, fantastic stories have a basis in historical fact, or if they belong purely to the realm of myth. We'll pull out the key details and the conflicting accounts as they're presented in the source material so you can get a clear picture.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the incredible legend itself is, it's described in the sources.
Yes, the sources describe this final test in really vivid, almost cinematic detail. It's often painted as a physically perilous, almost impossible trial.
I mean, just the setup sounds like something straight out of an action movie, doesn't it?
It really does. One common version talks about navigating this dangerous labyrinth or hall filled with mechanized wooden men, spears, darts, traps, even things like buckets of acid. These wooden figures were apparently designed to deliver just brutal blows from all sorts of angles to test skill and, well, resilience.
Oof. Acid. Spears. I mean, surviving that sounds like the test itself.
Right.
And if you somehow made it through that gauntlet, what then?
Well, the legend says the exit was blocked by a very heavy brazier, like a large cauldron filled with burning coals. The sources mention different descriptions of its weight. Some say 300 pounds, others push it up to maybe 500 pounds, maybe even more. And this vessel was emblazoned with images, a dragon and a tiger on opposite sides.
And the test was to move this burning hot thing.
Precisely. The account states the candidate had to lift it or maybe slide it, this burning hot cauldron, using only their forearms to clear the exit and escape the hall.
Just their forearms. And that's how they supposedly got the brands.
Yes, exactly. The story claims the friction and the intense heat from the brazier would brand the dragon and tiger images right onto the monk's forearms, permanently marking them as a Shaolin master, or I am Dame. The tale even claims these brands alone were enough to make enemies just flee upon seeing them.
Wow. But the sources mention quite a few variations on this core story, don't they? It's not like one single fixed legend.
Oh, absolutely. Which is, pretty common with folklore passed down over time. It really highlights how these narratives evolve. For instance, instead of just wooden men, some versions say the labyrinth involved fighting 108 fellow warrior monks.
108 monks. Okay.
Yeah. Others describe a more structured series of incredibly difficult tests before even entering the final hall. You'd first have to defeat the Luhan Tang, described in the sources as 18 top fighters, maybe representing the Arhats, then the Damo Yuan, the 4 abbot protectors, then the Senjingung, the 3 library defenders, before finally facing the Murain Sheng, which is the hall with the wooden dummies.
Wow. Okay, that adds whole layers of challenge.
Yeah.
And the details of the branding itself, they get kind of mixed up in the telling, too.
Absolutely. The location where this supposedly happened is debated. Was it the famous northern temple in Henan province, or maybe a southern temple, perhaps in Fujian? Who actually took the test is also uncertain. Was it only warrior monks, or perhaps just lay disciples finishing their training? There are conflicting claims on which arm got the tiger brand right or left, and which got the dragon. Some traditions even claim the brand was of 2 dragons, one on each arm, or, entirely different symbols depending on the temple, like crane and dragon, crane and tiger, or even phoenix and mantis.
So while the core image, that burning cauldron and the forearm brands, is incredibly vivid, the specifics really shift depending on who's telling it and the source of the legend. Does any of the source material try to lend actual credibility to the idea that this specific dramatic brazier test did exist in some form?
Well, there is one account mentioned in the sources that does suggest such a testing hall, with 108 mechanical attacks in a heavy hot vessel did exist at Shaolin, but it notes it was described as a voluntary ordeal, not mandatory, and explicitly not for the unskilled. Crucially, this account highlights that it frequently and severely injured or even killed those who attempted it.
Right.
Which, frankly, isn't surprising given the description, but it positions it more as a kind of deadly dare than a standard graduation requirement,
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so that's the elaborate legend with all its variations. What about personal stories? Eyewitness accounts. Does the source material include anyone claiming to have, seen the brands or known someone who went through this test?
Yeah, the sources do include a few interesting personal accounts that, at first glance seem to offer some kind of confirmation. William Chung, he's a well-known martial artist, he's quoted describing a southern Shaolin temple corridor that had 108 wooden dummies used for defense practice.
Okay.
So this part of the legend, the Wooden Men Hall, seems to have some echo in his description, suggesting maybe a real physical testing or training area existed. Although he doesn't mention the brazier or the branding specifically in that quote.
Okay, so the wooden dummies part might have some basis in reality, maybe just as an intense training method or an earlier stage. But what about the brand specifically?
Well, there's one claim in the source material that is quite compelling. The author says they personally met two men who were supposedly among the last monks to successfully complete this test before the temple's closure in 1950. These men allegedly had burn scars, a tiger on one forearm, a dragon on the other.
Wow, meeting people with the actual scars. That sounds like, powerful direct confirmation. What details does the source give about that encounter?
It does sound incredibly compelling, yes. The account states these men claim the necessary internal training and martial skills needed to survive the test weren't normally taught to outsiders. However, and this is really key from the source's perspective, like many such claims passed down in martial arts lore, it's presented in the source without specific, verifiable details.
Wow.
Like who these men were, when or where this meeting took place, or any independent corroboration. It's presented as a personal testimony within the source material, which is, different from hard historical evidence.
Right, that distinction is important when you're evaluating source material like this. What about David Carradine, the actor from the, iconic Kung Fu show? He's so strongly associated with popularizing this legend. Did his accounts add anything?
Carradine is definitely a central figure in the myth spread, and yeah, he's mentioned in the sources. In his book, Spirit of Shaolin, he states that his master, Kam Yuen, had a master named Mo Yuan, who apparently trained at the original Shaolin temple and did have the famous tiger and dragon brands.
So his master had the brands, according to that book.
That's what Carradine says there, claiming they were on this Mo Yuan. But then, the source points out a really interesting inconsistency within the material it examines. In Herbie J. Pilato's book, The Kung Fu Book of Cain, Carradine seems to shift the story. He says it was Kam Yen's master, Su Chu Kai, who had the brands, but on his stomach, calling it a rare mark of courage.
Okay, so wait. The story is already changing. Who had the brand and where it was located, even from the same source person.
Exactly.
Does the source offer any insight into why Carradine's account might have shifted like that?
The source doesn't explicitly analyze the why behind Carradine's inconsistency, no, but it presents it as a clear example of how these kinds of personal accounts in martial arts history can vary and, evolve in the telling. It's similar to how the legend itself has variations, right? It just highlights the difficulty in relying solely on anecdotal evidence, even from, well-known figures associated with the topic.
Fair point. What else did Carradine reportedly say in connection to the Cain show's depiction, which, famously showed the branding?
Well, he reportedly called the branding scene in Kung Fu utterly historical. He claimed monks really did walk a dangerous corridor with spears and acid, and those who made it then branded themselves by lifting the urn with either their arms or their stomach. He reportedly noted that many monks didn't survive the corridor and that they actually left out parts of the real test in the show because, and this is a quote, nobody would believe it. He also stated the practice had more or less been abandoned as barbaric.
Okay.
So what's fascinating here, as the source implies, is exactly what we just noted, how the personal accounts can twist slightly, even from the same person. The location of the brand, who exactly had it, the finer details of the test. This layering of slightly different, sometimes conflicting versions really starts to hint at the nature of how a legend can grow and change over time through retelling, rather than being some fixed, easily verifiable historical event.
Right. So leaving aside the personal accounts for a moment, which the source shows are pretty inconsistent and hard to verify. What does the source material say about the practicality, the technical difficulty of actually achieving a detailed brand this specific way with a hot brazier?
Yeah, the source argues quite strongly, actually, that the logistics make such precise branding highly improbable almost practically impossible, really. It examines historical branding practices and describes them as a very crude process that just doesn't lend itself to preserving fine detail in a design like a recognizable tiger or dragon.
So getting a clear, identifiable image of a tiger or a dragon would be incredibly tough using just friction and heat from some heavy, rough object.
According to the source, extremely difficult, yeah, if not impossible with that method. It mentions that even with advancements in modern branding techniques in the early 2000s, significant limitations remained in detail preservation. So trying to get a clear, lasting image this way, repeatedly, it seems highly unlikely from the source's technical perspective. And furthermore, attempting to brand the forearms by lifting a heavy, hot metal vessel like that wouldn't just cause a surface burn. The source points out it would likely cook muscle tissue and potentially even damage the bone beneath the skin due to the intense heat and pressure involved.
Yikes. That sounds incredibly dangerous, far beyond just leaving a scar or a mark. That sounds potentially debilitating, maybe even permanently crippling.
Absolutely. The source points out that such severe, deep wounds would also require considerable immediate medical attention, hygiene, long-term maintenance to prevent potentially life-threatening infection until they healed, which would take a very, very long time. So from a practical, medical, and logistical standpoint, the source suggests this method for achieving a detailed brand is highly unwise, incredibly risky, and likely not a feasible or desirable way to produce recognizable, consistent imagery as a mark of skill.
So purely from a physical standpoint, the source really casts significant doubt on the method described in the legend. Given the dramatic nature, the practical difficulties, and the inconsistencies in the personal accounts, has historical research, according to the source, found any concrete proof this specific event ever happened?
Right, and this is where the source makes an absolutely crucial point when you're weighing myth against history. As of the time the source was written, extensive academic research had found no credible historical evidence whatsoever to support the legend of the forearm branding test with the brazier. Zero.
None at all.
None. And what's particularly striking, as the source details, is the specific absence of key evidence that you would absolutely expect if such a prominent practice existed. The source lists them out. No actual branding vessel matching the descriptions has ever been discovered, not in archaeological digs, not anywhere. There are no historical documents or written accounts from the temple itself, or official records, or even independent observers referencing such a practice. And crucially, despite centuries of artwork depicting monks in temple life, no historical photographs, paintings, illustrations, or artwork have been found depicting anyone bearing such distinct tiger and dragon brands on their forearms.
So despite the compelling nature of the story and those scattered claims, there's basically zero corroborating physical or documentary evidence in the historical record or archaeological finds, according to the source.
That is exactly what the source states based on the research available. It notes that if these conditions were to change, if a vessel were found or verified, contemporary documents surfaced, it would certainly lend credibility to the tales. But currently, that crucial evidence is simply missing from the historical record. And that lack of evidence is a really powerful argument against the historical reality of the specific brazier branding test.
Okay, so the dramatic brazier branding test, as it's popularly depicted, seems pretty firmly in the realm of fiction. It lacks historical support and, practical feasibility. But the source mentions that behind every myth, there's often a grain of truth, right? Some historical practice that perhaps got exaggerated or twisted over time. What real Shaolin practices might have inspired this elaborate legend?
That's right. The source dives into a couple of possibilities that could have been the seeds for this elaborate flowering myth. First, the concept of a difficult, perhaps even dangerous physical test to leave the temple seems to have some basis in reality. Research suggests there was a final exam for Wosing wishing to depart a trial by combat known as Dǎshānmén. That's Onya.
A trial by combat to leave. Okay, what did that involve based on the source?
Well, tradition describes aspirants facing a group of senior warrior monks as their final test before being permitted to depart the temple grounds. Sometimes this was described as 18 senior monks and their master, or in other accounts, maybe 2 applicants versus 12 adversaries. The idea was, apparently, if even one applicant succeeded, then all those applying to leave were permitted to depart.
Interesting.
And it's important to note, as the source does, this was specifically for monks wanting to depart the temple after finishing their training. It wasn't for those staying, or non-warrior monks, or lay disciples. The exact timing of when Dǎshānmén stopped isn't clear, but it's definitely no longer practiced today in its historical combative form. Modern versions are often just performances or symbolic rites.
Okay, so a difficult physical test to leave the temple existed, involving combat, but the source doesn't connect this specific test to branding.
No, not Dǎshānmén itself leading directly to the forearm branding, no. But the source suggests another practice is the more likely, maybe more direct inspiration for the branding aspect of the legend, and that is Jièbā, or precept scars.
Jièbā. What is that exactly?
These were scars, burned onto the crown of the head for fully ordained monks. It was part of taking bodhisattva precepts, essentially, really solemn religious vows. It was a ritualistic burning done with incense sticks as a mark of religious commitment and sacrifice. It wasn't for identification or demonstrating martial skill.
Ah.
Now, lay disciples sometimes received these scars, but they were usually placed on the arm or the wrist.
Okay, so scars burned on the body as part of religious vows.
Yeah.
But typically on the head for ordained monks, maybe arm or wrist for lay disciples, and definitely not pictures of tigers and dragons. But it is historical practice of deliberate burning to leave a mark on the body within the Buddhist tradition itself.
Exactly. The source points to this as the most plausible historical practice that could have sort of morphed into the branding legend over time. This tradition's popularity varied throughout history. It was actually outlawed in China during the Qing dynasty. A partial ban was lifted relatively recently in 2007, allowing the ceremony to be performed again. The source strongly suggests that this ancient ritual of Jièbā burning scars as a mark of religious commitment is the primary historical inspiration for the modern, much more elaborate forearm branding legend.
So the myth likely combines elements of real physical tests, like maybe the idea of a difficult exit trial like Dǎshānmén, with the actual historical practice of religious branding, Jièbā. But over time, it twists the location, the purpose, the imagery from religious vows on the head or wrist to a martial test on the forearm with specific animals.
That appears to be the most rational conclusion supported by the historical details provided in the source material, yeah. It's a really fascinating example of how distinct historical elements can be blended and transformed into a compelling piece of folklore.
So if it's not historical fact, and it's likely a blend of these other practices, how did this elaborate myth even originate and spread to become so widely known, globally?
Well, the source traces several potential influences and threads that probably contributed to its popularization. It notes the legend didn't start with the 1972 Kung Fu TV series, which is a common assumption, but that show was certainly instrumental in popularizing it and spreading it globally. The folklore itself originated earlier, down in southern China.
Okay.
One interesting connection the source points to is traditions in southern China where tattooing was actually quite common among secret societies and criminal organizations like the Sanhe Hui, the triads. These groups also often practiced Dongfu. So this created a link in the popular imagination between body marking, martial arts, and maybe clandestine activities or intense dedication. Kind of cultural context where the idea of a martial body mark might really resonate.
That connection between body marking and martial arts in the cultural context of southern China makes a lot of sense as a sort of fertile ground for such a legend. Right. What other influences are mentioned?
Well, inspiration might go back even further, potentially as far as the 14th century Chinese novel Water Margin Story. It features a famous character known as the tattooed monk, Zishan. The source suggests this could be an instance of folklore being influenced by art or literature, rather than the other way around. A popular character with body art influencing later martial arts legends.
Interesting. Like life imitating art, in a way.
Sort of, yeah. Also, the source highlights how specific martial arts movements themselves might have played a role in reinforcing the imagery. In southern Shaolin Gumfu techniques, there are movements with really evocative names, like single tiger emerges from cave and dragon and tiger appear. The source suggests that if you imagine a monk's wide sleeves as caves, these movements could easily be associated with the idea of tiger and dragon images somehow appearing on the forearms as the techniques are performed. It shows how deeply the tale might be woven into the culture and even the practice terminology itself.
And the symbolism is powerful too, right? The dragon and tiger.
Oh, incredibly potent, and deeply ingrained in Chinese culture. Ancient Taoist traditions depict the dragon and the tiger together, representing the fundamental yin and yang principles you see in the Taiji Tu, the great ultimate diagram. This fundamental Chinese symbolism of complementary opposites likely contributed significantly to the choice of these specific images for the legend, giving it a deeper cultural resonance and meaning.
So it's this confluence of regional folklore traditions, maybe literary influences, powerful symbolic resonance, even martial arts terminology, and then finally, massive cinematic popularization kicks in.
Absolutely. And then, as we discussed, came the movies and TV shows that really cemented that specific dramatic image in the global popular imagination, often presenting it as historical fact. The source lists several influential cinematic examples that definitely helped propagate this lore. 1972 and 1993 Kung Fu series with David Carradine, the 18 Bronzeman films from the mid-70s. Shaolin Wooden Men in 76 starring Jackie Chan, The Eight Masters in 77, and even American Shaolin in 1991. These cinematic portrayals were undeniably key in popularizing the lore outside of China and shaping the global perception of Shaolin.
Given all this, the lack of evidence, the impracticality, the likely historical roots in other practices, the threads of its spread, what do monks actually living at Shaolin today say about these stories when they're asked?
Yeah, the source indicates a pretty consistent response from present-day monks. And most of them just laugh when asked about such folklore and popular legend.
And just laugh.
Pretty much. Shi Wanheng, a monk who remained at the temple after its destruction in 1928 and was interviewed much later, stated quite clearly back in 1988 that the branding practice was simply a myth. More recently, the source quotes Shi Xinghong, who's a 32nd generation Shaolin warrior monk. He explicitly questioned the logic from a practical martial arts perspective. He asked, and this is a quote, "No. Why would we want to burn our arms like that? You might end up a cripple, never be able to make a fist again in your life. What kind of gumfu test would that be?"
Right.
That statement from a practicing martial artist gets right to the technical implausibility we discussed from a very practical viewpoint.
Makes total sense.
And Shi Yanran, a 34th generation monk, was just as direct in 2012, stating that the legends about the exit exam and carrying the incense burner were more from stories from the movies.
So the consensus from actual Shaolin monks who live or have lived there seems pretty clear and, well, dismissive of the legend as it's presented in popular culture.
Yes. The source summarizes their general response as dismissing these tales as pihua, which is essentially nonsense or, bullshit. And they often attribute the foreign fascination to watching too much television or movies. The source mentions a report on USAShaolinTemple.com where Shi Yanming's response is discussed, noting the possibility it could have been due to a language barrier, or maybe him just amusing himself with the questions from Guno, that somewhat dated term for foreign devils. But the overall sentiment gathered from multiple monks seems consistent. It's a popular story, not historical reality within the temple's actual practice.
Okay, so after diving into the sources, examining the legend's many variations, the personal accounts and their inconsistencies, their lack of verification, the strong technical arguments against the branding method's practicality, the striking absence of credible historical proof from documents or archaeology, the possible historical roots like Dǎshānmén and Jièbā, the threads of its origin and spread through culture, literature, symbolism, and cinema. And finally, the direct views of the monks themselves. It seems the dramatic story of the Shaolin Forearm branding test with the heavy brazier is indeed, well, overwhelmingly supported by the sources as being largely fiction.
That seems to be the definitive conclusion supported by the detailed information presented across our source materials, yes. The image of that specific test and branding is likely far more fantasy and folklore than historical fact.
Right.
However, as the source points out in its conclusion, it's also clear that Shaolin's history and its mythos are just deeply intertwined. The sources acknowledge that separating verifiable fact from legend in China, and particularly with something as steeped in powerful stories as Shaolin, is incredibly complicated. It's like trying to navigate through smoke and mirrors, as they put it.
And this blending of history and storytelling isn't unique to Shaolin or even China. It happens everywhere.
Not at all. The source notes that all nations, all cultures, even specific traditions have this blend of history, myth, and legend passed down through oral tradition, written texts, and now, of course, modern media. Stories evolve, details get added, combined, or changed over time depending on who is telling them and why. Now, for academic historians and, philosophers, the distinction between verifiable fact and pure fantasy matters greatly for the purpose of an accurate historical record. But for many people around the world, the source suggests perhaps the difference between historical reality and the perception of reality, or maybe the illusion of reality created by compelling narratives, isn't as crucial in terms of cultural impact and meaning.
Because the story itself is just so powerful and resonant, it almost takes on its own reality.
Exactly. The source points out that while academic historians may strongly object to these apocryphal tales being presented as history, these stories have nonetheless become an inseparable part of the modern Shaolin mythos. They represent its essence, its mystique, its perceived power in the popular imagination. In that sense, these legends, even if they're not historically accurate in their specific details, are a vital part of the cultural understanding and identity of Shaolin for many, many people around the world.
And ultimately, it's that mystique, that fascination, and the inspiration these powerful stories provide, even if they're largely myth, that attracted many of us to the idea of Shaolin in the first place.
That's certainly true. The legends hold a really potent allure, and they've had a massive cultural impact globally.
So we've covered the dramatic legends and their variations, examined the conflicting personal claims and their limitations according to the source, explored the technical impossibilities of the branding method, looked at the striking absence of credible historical proof, investigated the actual historical practices that the source suggests may have inspired the myth, traced the various cultural threads contributing to its origin and spread, and finally heard the clear perspective from monks living at Shaolin today.
Yeah, we've seen how history and storytelling have always been blended and how powerful cinematic narratives can become such a significant part of a cultural identity and global perception, sometimes even overshadowing historical fact.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Shaolin Forearm branding, here's something for you to maybe ponder. If a story, even a fictional one, captures the spirit and inspires people as much as the Shaolin branding legend clearly has, does its historical accuracy diminish its cultural value or impact? And how do we navigate the stories we love and find inspiring when we're confronted with a historical reality found in the sources? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you learned something fascinating by digging into the sources with us today.